Hey, well, what is up, everyone? Welcome to episode number 44 of the Faith and Pop Culture Podcast. It is me, your host, Daniel, and I am joined, as I always am, by the Katy Perry to my outer space, Mr. Samuel David Camp. What is up?
No, not too much, Daniel. That was quite the it's quite an interesting cultural moment there when all those women astronauts went up
I thought
into
that
this.
would be one of those defining moments of our generation. Is the
Yeah,
you know
yeah, it
we'll
was very
all look back.
moving.
Where were you the day that Katy Perry exited the atmosphere?
Yeah, that was quite something.
I will say, in her defense, like, I mean, if I had just, endless amounts of money and fame, like, going to space is pretty cool. Like,
Oh yeah, I
I
mean,
know it was short, and I think they didn't, like, technically even actually reach outer space, all that stuff. But hey, she got closer than I would probably ever get to space. So, hey,
yeah,
why not?
yeah, technicalities aside, I think I mean, it is very cool, and I think lots of people would love to do that someday. And it seems like likely for the very wealthy among us, that will be an attainable goal in the near future.
Yeah, so all we got to do is just live a long time and make a lot more money than we do. And we too will be doing this podcast from outer space one day. Speaking of things that, actually not a lot of people get to experience in life, and that is become the Pope. That is actually a pretty select family of people that get to, the brotherhood of popes. So we have a new pope. This is kind of a big
We
cultural
do.
thing that happened. Like, we're neither of us are Catholics, but the Pope is still, I mean, that's still a big deal in the
Yeah.
religious world. And I thought it was interesting. I got a kick out of because I'm sure like I'm not alone. Like I'm sure a lot of people, especially like movie fans, like the first thought any of us had was the Conclave movie. Like, because I have no contact. Like, all I know about picking a pope is like the smoke, coming from the. Like I don't know
Yeah.
anything about the process of that. I just at some whenever they have one, there's different colored smoke, and then there's a pope, and then they go on from there. Uh, so like in the back of my mind through this whole process, like I was just thinking the Conclave movie, and like I have no idea how accurate that is. But I did think it's funny that like I think you were mentioning earlier before we started recording, like the movie shot up to like number one on the streaming platforms. Like everyone's like doing their research by booting up Netflix and I don't know if some people might not have seen, but like even the new pope, like there was an interview, the first American pope, in fact,
Yeah.
from Chicago, um, which he's a White Sox fan, so yeah, he's got that going against him. But the there's an interview with
Yeah.
his brother, no, older brother, younger brother, just his brother, um, who actually like revealed that like a day or so before he went, his brother went to the conclave, that like he in fact also did his research and watched the conclave movie to get an idea of like how this whole thing is going to play out. And I don't know if you find that as like just amusing and like fascinating as I do, but it's just one of those weird like kind of reality and like fiction and like kind of come together. And I don't know, maybe don't want to like read too much into it, but I is one of those sort of just moments that show like just the power of like cinema and film. Like, again, I don't know how accurate the movie is, but just to like give us insight into like experiences and like a world that like I feel like unless you're a select few people on this planet, like we just don't have any like view or understanding of. But what do you make of that? What do you make of our current pope doing his research based on good old fashioned Hollywood cinema?
Yeah, I don't know if that's one of those things that like should make you feel comfort and like, oh, he's just one of us, or if it's like one of those. I'm a little concerned if the Pope is going to Hollywood to brush up on the procedural expectations of his job before he goes and picks the next pope. So I don't know, but it is one of those like sort of fiction meets reality moments, and it's also just kind of amazing that like you're for the filmmakers, I'm sure, to have like to know that the current pope has watched your movie. I feel like it's a pretty like that just needs to go on all of the future marketing. You know,
Like the box pull quote.
yeah, yeah. Great
Tell me
movie.
everything I know.
Yeah, very realistic.
See,
Good
the
source
question
material,
is,
whatever, you know. So,
what movies did Donald Trump or whoever the next president will be, like what movies does the American president go watch to prepare for his time? Like I feel like Independence Day is probably one of the go-tos.
yeah, that's
Uh,
got to
well,
be.
ones because hey, you always got to be prepared in case those aliens come. But to my mind, that was a pretty
Which
good president. I can't think of many other president-focused movies where the president is like a
Air,
big joke.
Harrison Ford, Air Force One, was that
Oh yeah, that's the part. I feel like be more like Harrison Ford should be
kicking,
the answer for.
yeah, kicking bad guys off the airplane or something? I feel like that's got to be some good presidential inspiration.
Yeah, maybe that is sort of the American president version of Conclave. But speaking of the sacred world and church world, and then the heathen, secular, godless world, kind of the thing I wanted for us to just unpack a little bit in this episode is something that feels like it's a question that's been around for a long time. It's not like some new thing, but I do feel like the current context of just like the entertainment industry, at least to me, kind of makes it more of a relevant discussion. And that is sort of the whole kind of debate, conversation, distinction, whatever you want to call it, of sort of like the sacred secular divide. Because I feel like that's become, I mean, and there's different like areas you can think of that in. You can think of it in, politics. You can think of it, sort of, church and state stuff. Or I'm kind of thinking mostly kind of in the sense of just sort of the arts and, I feel like especially now that like the faith-based genre has become so like prevalent and, influential and like, become more established as a thing. Sort of those lines seem like they've been like just drawn more like clearly in a way. Like there's now that there's like enough of like a foundation for faith-based stuff. It's like we don't really need to to dip into the secular Hollywood world because we have our own stuff going. And like obviously it's maybe distributed through old school Hollywood, but it's still like our people. And I don't know, it just feels like there's sort of this distinction between sort of like Christian art and non-Christian art. You kind of hear people throw around terms like that, Christian artists, and as opposed to like secular artists. And like I said, it's always been like a weird, like it's always been kind of awkward and tricky to like categorize kind of art with the label like Christian. Like I don't know
Yeah.
if you grew up, you probably did because we grew up in the same era of like the when it became like real trendy for like whenever there was like a bunch of Christians that would start like a big metal band and then they would have like crossover success and like they were popular outside of they broke out of into the mainstream and they're playing on Warp Tour and like these secular concerts and it became sort of the whole thing of like we're not a Christian band, like we're Christians in a band, sort of trying to draw that
Oh yeah.
distinction. And like it's like like in hindsight the more I think about that is like I get what they mean, but I don't know, like they just like is there any real substance to that? Like what does it mean to be you're not Christian band but you're Christians and you're in a band, and so is your just sort of drawing that weird distinction between like we're a Christian but like what we're doing isn't necessarily Christian, but like it kind of is because we're Christians. We're not doing anything blasphemous. Like it's just it sounds it's a good slogan that kind of falls apart the more you get into it. And even like I often think of like as far as I know, as far as like the main ones at least that like pop up first on like in the menu like on iTunes, like Christian is like kind of the one genre that's categorized like not by style or like type of like you click Christian and you have like Christian metal and you have Christian pop and Christian worship and like Christian soundtracks for Jesus movies, and like it's sort of all in there because it's Christian. It's it's secular or sacred music as opposed to like, all the different categories based on style, like of these, the secular type music. So I don't know. What do you sort of think of some of that? Because we can get into. I thought we get into a bit of like. I feel like the more like there is sort of this Christian, so-called Christian art, like becomes more popular. Like the more we just sort of need to, I think through our vocabulary for that, and like, and even just our mindset to that, because I feel like there's sort of implications to it, I think, that go deeper than just, a matter of semantics of what we call this band's, category. But what are maybe some of your like initial thoughts? Like, have you thought through that much, or like dealt with any of that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that we've talked about a few times before, um, on and off the podcast. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it is something that's kind of gone back. I mean, it probably started like in the 70s or so, but I feel like our childhood definitely was like it was full on. You could live a life in this Christian bubble and really not have to, like, you could have the Christian version of just about everything, sort of entertainment wise, I think. So like there was Christian music, Christian movies, you know, and on down the line, like whatever else you could think of, there was a Christian version. And which is it's just a weird thing because I think the art is sort of a unique place where this kind of thing happens, where it's like we just I just don't think people know how to really deal with it like they do um in any other profession. So, you know, if you're a carpenter or a plumber or a mechanic or a doctor or whatever, it's like I think a lot of that seems, well, you're a Christian, whatever you are, like that's, you know, that's who you are, and so that's going to mean certain things for your work ethic and how you do your job and how you relate to the people. But then for entertainment, it's like a there's sort of a scrambling of the wires, and it's like, oh wait, uh we have to, like, it can't just be, you know, good art, it needs to be good Christian art. And what does that mean? And then so I think that it's just kind of a unique, I think, problem that especially the Western church has, that like we have this whole subgenre of entertainment and music and everything else that's also very much tangled like with commerce as well, which I think is another element to it that can kind of gum up the works, if you will. And so, and I don't know that we have a great vocabulary to talk about it in the church. And also it just, I don't think we often think about the long-term or downstream implications of calling this thing Christian music, or making those sort of somewhat artificial distinctions and also not being clear what that means. And so, and also what it does mean and what it means for, you know, other things as well. So, yeah, I
Yeah,
think
because
that go
no,
ahead.
sorry, yeah, like I feel like what you're saying, like they're like it's the like I feel like the way you sort of determine, if you're categorizing things as like kind of Christian art as opposed to secular non-Christian art, like then I feel like there is sort of that wider implication of like, the way you determine therefore like what makes art Christian, I think is also reflected in, and like in a circular way also kind of informs the way you just think about, what makes everything like, like faith, what does it mean for something to be Christian as opposed to secular? And I feel like sort of where you start drawing that line in the arts, if Christian art is songs or movies about this one thing, and that sort of, and everything else is not Christian, then like there is sort of like a trickle down effect of like, well, that's also maybe how you see, you know, like just life. But to be a Christian is those things that are like those things in the arts, as opposed to kind of anything else. And I think you are right. Like like if you train to be a doctor, and then you get a job at a clinic, and it's a secular clinic because it's not like church's medical clinic. It's whatever it might be. Um, like we would never think of, I'm like a crossover doctor. I'm not a Christian doctor. Like I'm a Christian who's a doctor. Like
Yeah,
none of those sort of same things work. Like,
right.
oh, you're in the secular world. It's like, no, you're in the medical world, and the medical world is, I think, innately Christian. Biology, all that stuff stems from God's creation, and the trying to make people healthier is very much a Christian thing. Like, there isn't sort of that, like, are you a Christian doctor, or are you like, one of those worldly ones? Are crossing over? Are you a sellout? Like, and if you can do that for anything, a cook at a restaurant, like you can do that for like, any profession, basically, other than the
I do.
arts.
Yeah, I do think maybe the only other place where it can kind of tend to crop up is maybe like as a business person. So I think there's a lot of like, Christian business, whatever leadership things or Christian business. I think there is maybe not obviously to the extent of with the arts, but I think there is some of that sort of baptization of like business in general, but not like a particular niche within business. But I think that's maybe the only other place that I can think of that kind of has some of that like
Yeah, I
those
feel like it
vibes of like
does, but I feel like there's also not. Maybe it's just like a different willingness. Like I feel like there's not the same pressure though. Like there's more of a respect of like, hey, you're just a successful businessman, and it's cool that you're a Christian and you have an influence and you're doing stuff. And but I feel like there's not the same pressure to like, and your company better be making crucifixes to hang on our wall. Like
well, no, but I do think there is this sort of expectation that's like, so you started a Bible study during your lunch hour, or like you have like, chaplain services for your, executives. So I do think there is some of that in the business world of like, if you're a Christian business person, then you're trying to sort of smuggle in, not smuggle, that's maybe the wrong word, but you're trying to do things in like in your headquarters that are Christian. So like having a Bible study that's optional or some of these kinds of things. And so it's not just like, have ethical practices in, how you source your products. It's like, but have like a Bible study or, do these sort of Christian things that are kind of on the peripheral or periphery of what you do as your core business.
I
But
think,
again, I think it is different.
yeah, I think maybe in some ways I think it is different as far as like, but I think you're right. As long as you're, like, we're okay for you to make, you're not making Christian products, but we're sort of okay for the like, the equivalent of like, I'm not a Christian, we're not a Christian band, we're a Christian in the bag. We sort of are okay with that mindset in the world. But I think it's kind of like you were saying, what comes to mind is even like The Forge, like the Kendrick Brothers movie.
Yeah.
Um,
Top
if people
five for
haven't
you,
seen that
right?
movie, I don't think you, at least I won't tell you which list is top five on, but it's definitely top five. Um, but for anyone that hasn't seen the movie, like it's all about mentorship and discipling, and like it's like a young kid that's irresponsible and he needs money because he's irresponsible, and his mom's wants him to grow up, and so he like, ends up applying for jobs, and he gets hired at like a gym, and the guy that owns the gym happens to be a Christian, and he sort of uses his that dynamic to like, he's like, I'll hire you and like let you do this, but you got to agree to like meet with me for lunch, and basically get kind of mentored as a Christian. And which is totally like, even as someone that is a Christian, like even my wife, because she was with me at the premiere for that, like was sort of like, I think we both felt like maybe it's like, not even saying that it's like totally wrong to sort of do some of that. It just left me feeling a little uneasy about like the power dynamic of it. But it's
Yeah.
funny, like that sort of is elevated as like, because there's nothing about the business. Like he owns like a gym or something, or gym equipment or something. And like, and sort of the implication is like what he's doing there doesn't matter. Like it's just, that's just work. That's just secular
Yeah.
art. But like it's the, having this employee kind of forced to come and have Bible studies with him. Like that's the that's what makes him a Christian businessman. Like, so it totally is sort of that. That's sort of our ideal picture. Um, so yeah, so maybe there is like other applications, um, but then we can kind of get into it because for me, sort of like, what does it mean to be Christian art, or Christian entertainment, or Christian artist, or like, I feel like if we're going to sort of use those terms, we should sort of know like sort of what where the line is. Like we should sort of know like what the qualifications are for this to be, because there's weird ones of, hey, this is a Christian band, but they're singing about, a rock show and they don't mention Jesus, or hey, this is a, someone that doesn't really believe in God, but they're singing, a song about prayer and desperation, and I actually am moved by it. Or, here's a band that wrote a song and it was really meaningful for me, and then, years later they actually fell away from the faith, and turns out they never really believed in their heart. And so is it still Christian even though they weren't sincere? Like, there's all these weird things. So that we kind of get into them and sort of, kind of go one by one, and then maybe end with what I think is maybe the better distinction. But because to me, like in my experience, and maybe there's more, and you guys, if you guys are watching and listening, like let me know if there's other ways to break it down. But what I have found in sort of just being in this space for a while is like there tends to be three different things that we mean, and sometimes these three can like overlap, and there can be more than one. But kind of the three options for like what makes something Christian are like the content, what the actual like subject matter of the work of art or movie or whatever it might be is. The second one is the creator, like, hey, regardless of sort of what they're making, like if you're a Christian making it, then that sort of is Christian, and you can sell it at a Christian bookstore, and if you're not a Christian, then regardless of the content, you don't sell it at a Christian bookstore because it depends on the creator. And kind of the last one, I would maybe call like condition of the heart or something, just to keep the alliteration going of the C's. But like the more the like the spirit in which it was made, like a more like ethereal, like, is something that was made with good intentions or in some sort of like spiritual ecstasy of, of faith. And it's like the more sort of idealistic sense. So why don't we sort of look at each of those, like this sort of, because I feel like there's like benefits to doing each one, but I mean, to show my hand up front, like I think each one of them has reasons why it's just not a helpful metric. But kind of content, like what do you think for that? Like that's because obviously that's the easiest way to like, hey, this song is about praising Jesus, like Christian. This is a painting. Oh, it's Jesus on the cross, like, or, it's David slaying Goliath, like Christian art. That's sort of the easy one, and I think you can even stretch it to like themes. Like C.S. Lewis, Narnia. It's like, well,
Yeah.
I mean, there is, if you read between the lines, there is sort of Christian stuff, but it's not like, you know, explicitly a Bible adaptation, but it's all allegory and themes and stuff, and it clearly like Christian art. Um, what do you see as some of like the event? Like, does it make sense to just, hey, if it's about Jesus in the Bible, then that's what we mean by Christian art? Like, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think so much of this kind of comes down to, I think we as people and subsequently we as Christians want to have shorthands for sort of determining or judging material. And so I think the content is a pretty straightforward one when it comes to like, this is Christian. Um, I think in most cases, however, I think it leaves the door open to like, non-Christians can make Christian art then. And it's like, as long as you agree with the message of it, then you just sort of baptize it and say it's Christian. So I think it can, I think it's a fine enough, maybe shorthand, like on the surface for, maybe certain things, but I definitely don't think it's an adequate, um, I don't think it's really an adequate categorization because it tends to just leave off a, a bunch of, a bunch of themes because I think the Christian themes and the content is typically skewed in like a positive direction of like redemption, which obviously I'm all for, but I think it's I think if you look at the stuff that falls under this category, you'd probably say it's all sort of skewed in the direction of like, evangelistic, people coming to faith, overcoming obstacles to believe in Jesus. I think it's all going to be kind of going in that direction, but not ever really dealing with like, what Christians do with their doubts or, what is it? How does a Christian grieve differently than the world, or a non-Christian? And some of these harder issues don't tend to bubble up to the surface if you're sort of thinking of like Christian content.
Yeah, because
And so I,
even like for me, what comes to mind is like something like the John Wick movies. Like to me, those reflect the gospel really strongly in at least part of the gospel, like the need for the salvation, if not the actual salvation. But like, because like those show like God in the gospel is clear in the fact that like there is no God of the gospel in those movies. Like it's very like a world
yeah,
sort of stripped away from like, but like you would never consider a John Wick movie to be you know Christian, even if I think it is reflect. Because I think you're right. The problem with the content stuff is it's just like it works for the stuff that's, I mean, essentially it's religious art is what we're saying. Like it works for the things that is
right.
like able to express religious material. What it doesn't do is capture anything that's not like, like abstract art. Or you have a sincere believer that wants to offer something of beauty to God, so they sit at the piano and they just come up with a beautiful melody, and there's no lyrics. It's not a hymn. It's just melodies and the way music and the math of music coming together, and using the sounds of creation and all that stuff. Like is that Christian? Like, how would we even know? Like,
Right.
you have to do a deep dive and figure out if it was Christian or not. Like, there's or just yeah, there's it limits it to sort of religious art, which to me is not the same thing as sacred. Like I think it gives us sort of the implication of sort of Sunday morning Christianity. Like that's and like you
Yeah.
hear it. To me, it's the most obvious with music. Because like you turn on the radio, like the Fish, whatever, or like Joy FM, or all these like Christian radio, like it's essentially Sunday morning experience. Like all the
What,
songs are.
no, that just reminded me, like we were in the car and my 6-year-old, I think within about like, I think I changed it to one of the local Christian channels and it was in the middle of a song. And I think within like 5 seconds, my 6-year-old asked like, Dad, is this Christian music or like, is this church music? Like, so even a 6-year-old like straight away can tell it's like this is church music. This is not you know the rock and roll we normally listen to.
Yeah, I mean,
So I
I'm
I
almost
think that's
saying
interesting. Like,
even singing in a different language, I feel like you could pick out this is Christian. Like it has a very, and I know that's too simplistic, and there's at least the stuff that makes it onto those radio stations.
right.
Some of the more deep stuff or different unique stuff maybe doesn't make it on, but it is very like all the songs are about Jesus. All the songs are about worshiping Jesus and praising him and singing for him, and or just walking with him, in a general terms of doubt, and through the valley of the shadow of death kind of stuff. um you're not necessarily going to hear a lot of songs that's just like, here's a love song to some, a young crush I have, or like, hey, here's I'm going fishing, I'm going to sing about this fish and I love the outdoors, country song, or like just some of those like Monday through Saturday experiences. That's not usually the fertile soil to build some of these songs on. Very much
Yeah,
is sort of what's
Christian
Christian is
music
the
is
stuff
really,
that's singing about Jesus.
yeah,
Yeah, or
it's
like
the
it
mountaintop. It's the mountaintop music. It's not
because
the
like
valley, the day to
yeah,
day.
like movies do that too. For like Christian is the one that either is like House of David or The Chosen, where it's like the Bible stuff, or else it's like The Forge, where it's like, well, it's about the Monday through Saturday, but we're only going to focus on the parts that are kind of like Sunday morning. Like we're not going to just sort of look at the mundane stuff that's not, the more secular stuff of our life. And what really matters is just sort of this is a movie about work, but like we're gonna have a lot of scenes where they're actually meeting after work and having like a church service in their workplace, and like it's kind of that. Like I think we just equate it with religion, and I think there's issues with that. Like I think like I think outside of music, we sort of condemn that of like, don't just be a Sunday morning Christian, like, be a Christian out in the world and all that kind of stuff. But then like the way we sort of categorize Christian in art is sort of like I remember even growing up, like there was I don't know if you remember, they're still around, like the band Thousand Foot Crutch. Like they're sort of a
Oh
Christian,
yeah.
like in the late 90s rock and roll band. And like I remember they had like a new album was coming out and they dropped a new song and I think it was called like Bounce or something. It was entirely like a party, like you sing it in a concert. It's all about like jumping in the mosh pit and like, it wasn't. And they had like Christian, songs about Jesus and stuff too. But I remember like I was like in youth group at the time, and like there was like legit debate of like oh like so like they released a secular song, like it's they're a Christian band, but like are they have they sort of gone secular now? Like are they still going to make
Did they
Christian
lose their
music, or is
faith?
like kind of the idea that like this can't be Christian because they didn't sing about singing God's love forever or something. Like they were singing about like turn the volume to 11 and bounce and we're gonna rock this place, and it's like that can't be Christian. Which I mean, like, and the irony of that is that like all these Christians asking that question, like that Thousand Foot Crutch came at my first concert. That they were the first band I ever saw in concert, and a bunch of us went, and we're in the mosh pit, and we're bouncing, and we're like, it's like as Christians we experience that same thing like in reality, and yet when it came to the music, it's like, well, but that's not Christian because it's not about Jesus. Like
Yeah.
we need more like Christian content. So I think that's sort of where it falls short. And I found a good quote, and then we can move on to the next one. But Francis Schaeffer, I go back to this book, Art in the Bible, a lot. It's like a short, it's somewhere on my shelf behind me, but it's like 90 pages, a little pamphlet, a great like starting point. Just for it's not perfect. I don't necessarily agree with like all of it, but that's usually where I tell people start with this if you want to think about like the arts and Christianity. But in that book or that track, he says, if you are a Christian artist, therefore, you must not freeze up just because you can't do everything at once. Don't be afraid to write a love poem simply because you cannot put into it everything of the Christian message. Yet, if a man is to be an artist, his goal should be in a lifetime to produce a wide and deep body of work from which his worldview will show forth. And essentially what he's saying is like not every like your whole life and your whole artistic output that should reflect kind of the core of who you are and how you see the world, and part of that is definitely religious and how you relate to God, but like not everything you make has to reflect those aspects of your like they should reflect everything about your experience. So that's kind of the first one. And again, we can kind of circle back to that one too. Um, I think the second one is like the creator. Like Christian art is art made by a Christian. Like I feel like that's another kind of simple um, one, and it kind of gets away from some of the problems of the first one of like, okay, like this song is a love song, and they don't even mention Jesus. They don't even try and like use that ambiguous like he's singing about a girl or is he singing about God? Like it could be both. It's like this is just a legit love song, but like they are a Christian, therefore we're okay with like playing it on the Christian radio or something. Um,
Yeah.
and again, it makes sense, I guess. Like you would assume, like if you know that if you're a Christian, your art should therefore be Christian. Um, But I think like the content stuff, like it's just too limiting. I think almost like in the inverse of like one, it doesn't allow non-Christians to reflect the gospel in their art, which I think is just as anyone that's like experienced a lot of art and movies from people who aren't Christians and found the gospel in it. It's like you got to do something with that. If it's like, well, this is clear, I'm moved by
Yeah.
this, and they're not a Christian. Um, and I think for me, it just puts way too much emphasis on the person rather than the thing. And I mean, it can be awkward too. Like if you paint a painting of an elephant and then some godless heathen atheist painted a painting of an elephant, like, is your painting Christian and there's not? Like, or do both sort of reflect the gospel and God's creation? Or, if you paint a landscape and it's like yours is the beauty of creation because you're a Christian, and his is just meaningless secular art. Like the further you follow that down, there's some issues. But what do you see? Like, is it like what are maybe some of the benefits or like disadvantages of?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the disadvantage you've pretty clearly laid out, but I think maybe one of the benefits would just be that maybe it's a great sort of entry point for people who want to support artists and don't know who to support. So like maybe start with, you know, Christian artists who, I mean, hopefully you like what they're doing, whether it's paintings or, you know, mixed media or movies or music or whatever. You know, I think it can be a good place to say, okay, I like what this person is doing. Um, no, it's not all, you know, Sunday service appropriate, maybe, but, you know, I think there can be some comfort in like knowing where it's coming from. And so as a, you know, if you want to be a patron of the arts, that's maybe a good place to start. And so I think it can kind of offer some of that, like, okay, you can maybe feel better about your art consumption or your experiences with art if you are starting at least with people that you know are believers. Again, I think it's a starting place. I don't think it's necessarily the end goal, but I think it just perhaps just offers some sort of comfort to people if they're like they feel like they need to be more plugged into art, then I think that's maybe a good place to start.
Yeah, and I think you actually mentioned it earlier that like I feel like a lot of this conversation, like it's you almost can't understand it outside of like the aspect of like commercialism and like consumerism. Like I feel like
Yeah.
a lot of the reason we have these labels is to more easily distribute, often in the terms of selling and profiting from these goods to the audience that we think will like that's why we can market, categorize music as all Christian regardless of genre, because we know Christian are going to buy a metal album more likely if it's in a Christian bookstore and labeled Christian metal as opposed to in a metal just regular in the shelves somewhere. Like I mean that's maybe a more cynical view of that, but I do think like a lot of this where this distinction became the most established, I think we're still feeling that, is sort of that CCM music phase, like era, which was very much driven by commercialism and like and other no, not there wasn't also like good things and motivations too, but a large part of that distinction became sort of that, and it can help, like you said, if you just want to. I think that's like the benefit of like Angel Studios or things like this. It's like we sort of know this is sort of art made by Christians for the most part, or at least reflective. And so we don't really need to weed through, and we can support that because we want them to succeed and not necessarily, a bunch of terrible Hollywood people. Real quick, and there's not really much to get into this one, then we can get into the maybe what I think is the better way to think about this is kind of the third one. This is like the condition of the heart. Um, it's really is a more like ambiguous, like there's not really it's like so vague that it's not helpful. But I've heard people sort of present or try to articulate like, that hey, it's more just like, the spirit in which the art was made. And, maybe they were Christian, maybe they weren't, maybe the art is Christian, maybe it's not. But they sort of made it with Christian intentions and, in some sort of, they were inspired by the Holy Spirit and they made it. Um, and for me this is the weakest one because it's even if
Yeah.
even if it was true, there's just it's not helpful, like how do we know like what, and I feel
Yeah.
like it's usually
Monday I made a Christian piece. Tuesday it was definitely not a
yeah,
Christian
I didn't feel
piece.
the Holy
Like,
Spirit in this, but I feel like this one's the most attractive too to people that haven't tried to create art, like because it is sort of this like romanticized, like you just the spirit comes upon you and it just flow, like, the very like
yeah.
idealistic sense of just flowed out of me, and I felt like it was God writing on the page and not me. And like the reality is that like most of these art things, like like if you're like a Christian writing like literature, like you're writing hours and hours every day for like a year. Like you're not in some constant state of, or like songs change over time and there's other factors and people and like, maybe you're a band and like one of them was, inspired that way and the other ones were not. And maybe one of them wasn't even a Christian. Like it's just,
Yeah.
there's this, I don't think we need to like, do like a deep dive to try and figure out like, hey, what state were you in when you wrote this in order to decide if it's Christian? Like to me, that's just, I don't know. There's nothing really to that. Which kind of maybe we can end on this like so if those aren't, I don't think they're necessarily bad. I think they are helpful in different ways and can like be incorporated. But for me, I think the big problem, the reason that none of those work, is that I feel like we're starting from like a broken premise of the secular sacred divide. Like I feel like
Yeah.
regardless of how we sort of work that out, and like build that up from that, foundation. I think the foundation sets us on a bad path of, if we're trying to sort of have this binary of like some things are Christian, like, that we need to have Christian art as to distinguish it because it's something very different from secular art. And there's a quote, it's actually by at least the one where I found it. I think other people have maybe used it by Rob Bell, who isn't necessarily the Christian spokesperson that I want to use because he is, since the time he did this, he's kind of fallen away from the faith, or at least like the Orthodox traditional faith. But in one of his books, he did make, when he was still making Christian books as opposed to secular books, he made a good statement where he said, Christian is a great noun, but a poor adjective. And if you're not like a wordy nerd like I am, what essentially that means is like Christian, it's like people can be Christians, things cannot really be Christians. Like,
Yeah.
you can't really, it's one thing to be, a Christian, like this person is a Christian. But when you start saying like Christian artist or Christian music or Christian song or Christian doctor or Christian chicken sandwich or whatever it is, like it becomes, the word kind of loses its meaning. Like what do you take from that quote? Like, what do
Yeah.
you,
No,
do you
that's
agree
a
with it?
great, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, I think that's a really, um, I think that's a great, sort of a great way to look at this issue is that, Christian is a great noun, but it's a bad, it's a poor adjective. I think that really summarizes well sort of a lot of what we're getting at when we are trying to wrestle with the idea of Christian art or, Christian music or all of these things. It's like, yeah, it's unfortunate that we have to have some of these descriptors, but I do think like at the end of the day, yeah, people are Christian or not, and the stuff they make, you know, it's almost impossible to call it Christian. If you really boil down, like, what is it to be a Christian? Well, that painting isn't like, that's not a redeemed painting. Like Christ did not die for that work of art or for that song. And so I think that's a much better framing when you think about art and artists. I think it's just yeah, I really like that quote.
Yeah, and I should say too, I should have said earlier, like in some ways I'm a big hypocrite because as I've just said, we shouldn't do that. Like on the Collision, we call our movie reviews Christian movie review.
Yeah.
I'm sort of work, but I've always hated that. Like I do it, which again kind of goes to some of the practicality of it. Like I think why there's not all just bad intentions. Like it is sort of the system that we're in, and like it helps people know like I'm a Christian, like so they know that this review is going to be done by someone looking at it as a Christian. Not that my movie review is going to heaven or something. So there is
Yeah.
sort of that aspect, but yeah, I think the Bell thing, because to me, and in some ways, I feel like it's kind of ambiguous, but like I feel like that's actually a good, like I feel like art should be ambiguous. Like it
Yeah.
shouldn't be as maybe it's not as like easy to grasp and like real practical in that sense, but like I feel like when you start making art that fits sort of that very utilitarian kind of practicality, like then you're sort of missing the point of art. But because to me, I've always seen like rather than like, hey, is this secular, is this sacred or secular? Like for me, I see sort of more the distinction of like art that brings glory to God and art that doesn't. Like, and I think sort of how does it do that? Like for me, if you make like I would call it sort of like transcendental art, which is this sort of theological way of like the good, the true, and the beautiful. Like art that is good, true, and beautiful, and reflects those qualities of God. Like that brings glory to God. Art that isn't good or true or beautiful, like doesn't bring glory to God. I don't think is glorified by art that's filled with a bunch of lies and immorality and ugliness and like it's like for me that's the better distinction, or like how at least that's how I think of art, of like because I think a Christian can make art with religious themes that doesn't bring glory to God, like even if they are trying,
Yeah.
like, and I think a non-Christian can make art that does bring glory to God, or at least helps other people see his reflected glory, whether their artist is trying to or not, just because they're made in God's image and they can't help but reflect. And I think you would assume or hope that Christians that know God and know the goodness, truth and beauty of God would be the ones most equipped to make art that glorifies God. Um, but I think it's wide enough too that like I think we can also bring glory to God through a great melody, or like just a beautiful array of bright colors and abstract shapes that we come up with, and I think God can be glorified, and even if it's not like you know have to have a little caption that explains the meaning of this abstract painting is the chaos of life without God. Like we don't need
Yeah.
to like baptize it, because I think the beauty of that can bring glory to God. Uh, what do you think of that? Like, is that way
No,
too like opaque to be
no, I don't
helpful?
think so. But I think when you frame it in those terms, I think it becomes, and again, this may be a slightly more cynical take, but I think it becomes more obvious that one of the reasons that we have these labels like Christian music, Christian movies, it makes it infinitely more saleable. And so you can like when you've been able to define this as a Christian thing, you can sell more of it to the Christian audience. And so you can see how in some ways if you remove those distinctions and leave it up to people to decide, that's way harder to categorize, and I think people can be a little more confused about it, and marketers can not market it as effectively, and they then cannot sell it as effectively and as many as they'd like to. But I think aside from sort of maybe the more commercial aspect of it, I think a good representation of sort of maybe the grander arc of what we've been talking about. There's a great biography of Johnny Cash, and I think it's just called Cash, and I forget the author offhand. But his life, I think, is one that's really interesting in that it had this arc of like he grew up in a small town going to church. He becomes famous. I mean, he just goes off the rails. Like he's among the first like true like rock stars in sort of the modern sense. Like he's up there like with Elvis, like he's just living the dream. But then like later in life, like he goes to rehab and he connects, I think, with Billy Graham, and he starts doing a lot more of like religious music, and he does a whole like, faith albums, and then like which it feels really hokey. Like a lot of them kind of feel like forced in a way, and but it was like it was him struggling to like want to do something beyond his music with his life. And then at the end of his life he releases these albums that were produced by Rick Rubin, sort of the famous, he's still a famous and just uh, prolific producer. And it's these were like the very last albums that he made just before he passed, and they're, I think, some of his greatest music. And some of it was like he did a cover of the Nine Inch Nails song "Hurt," which is basically about drug use. But it's some of the like I think some of his best music because it sort of contains, this lifetime of an artist kind of encapsulated in these last few albums that he did. And I think to me that sort of represents maybe just the grand arc of what it is we've kind of been talking about today. And I would encourage folks to check out that biography, even if you're not like, you know, you're not a Johnny Cash fan. That's fine. Like he's not for everyone. But
He
I
should
think,
be.
yeah, he should be. He should be. And shame on you for not being a fan. But I do think it to me it was just really eye-opening to see, you know, somebody who's been in secular music want to transition into like Christian music. This was like even before like the whole CCM movement and just really wrestle with that. And then I think some of his greatest stuff was kind of on the other side of that when he went back and he started covering some of these songs and just the poignancy of those songs like on his last few albums. I think just kind of speak to this idea that we've been talking about today. So
Yeah, and he's not the only one too. 'Cause, like, there's other ones I can think of that, like, obviously I want everyone to be saved, so don't take this the wrong way. But like, there's almost like some like directors and stuff where it's like I want them to be saved, but maybe not yet. Like I don't necessarily want some of these guys to like because there's been people that have like great artists that have become Christians, and then I mean even I don't necessarily agree with it, but that's like T.S. Eliot, the great you know poet that did The Wasteland, like because he was sort of an atheist and became a Christian, and like people like critics will sort of say that you can see a stark like once he sort of felt like he had to do Christian stuff, like the quality of his poetry kind of lost its charms, and like they felt sort of restricted to I can't just sort of I don't have the freedom I once had to just explore life. Now I got to explore religion, and it just is too narrow. That yeah, I think there is something to that I think yeah, it's not you know it's easier to say hey if this is about Jesus or if he's a Christian, it's Christian art as opposed to just like hey does this art bring glory to God? Does it reflect the goodness and truth of God? There's a simplicity to sort of the other way, but I just feel like the experience of art and like the breadth of what art can do and potential is just so much greater when we like take some of those restrictions away and just hey like go explore the realities of life, and do it in a way find the goodness and truth and beauty in the world, and and pull those elements out and point people to where they can find those, and like with the understanding that those will ultimately reflect God. And like so to me I think like the entire sort of sacred site in some ways it's like I feel like rather than seeing that as a divide, like we need to learn to sort of see the sacredness of sort of the mundane secular world where like God is everywhere, not just at church, and like we can find God and his glory in all of life and the mundane things, not just in our worshipful songs. But hey, we're curious to hear if you guys are, listening into this podcast. Don't be shy. Leave us a comment of sort of how you navigate that, whether you find it helpful, um, or even if you do find it helpful, if you find it proper to distinguish sort of, do we need Christian art, or is it helpful and can't do away with it, or is there better ways to sort of think about just sort of that traditional sacred secular divide. But one thing that I know that if there is any doubts, I will be able to remove all of those, because it is my turn to share in the final segment of this podcast. We have things we like that you should like too. So this is my week to share, and I thought I would share some good old-fashioned secular music. So this isn't Christian art, and I don't necessarily know if it brings how much glory it brings to God, but it does warm my heart and get my metal head, shaking on the neck. And that is the band Orden Ogon. So this is a band. They are a German power metal band. The name Orden Ogon, if you don't speak German, translates to the Order of Fear. So you can sort of put that one in your back pocket. But this band, I mean, this one, if you're doing a workout or something, like, you don't need steroids or you don't need like caffeine pre-workout drinks. Like, you just need Ordinogon, because this is like metal, but very melodic. Like, they do a lot of vocal layers. Like, it's not screaming metal like they sing, but he has like a good German power metal deep voice. Uh, a lot of like people have called it sort of like stadium metal. Like, it's a lot of sort of anthem kind of songs, and I mean the guitarist every song almost just is shredding some guitar solo that uh, I think must bring glory to something because it's pretty incredible. Have you ever dabbled? Have your ears ever been blessed with some German power metal? You might even say German's finest power metal, Orden Ogan.
I don't think so. There was one that you had recommended a while back that I checked out that was all like about like war
Oh,
and
Sabaton.
Sabaton. Yeah, yeah. That was I put that in when I was running, and I do think I shaved some seconds off my 5K time.
Well,
So
if you want to
it has
save
its
even
uses.
very practical. I will definitely be sending you some links after we finish recording this podcast, and
But
maybe you can do a deep dive review of Orden Ogan of their new album for next week's podcast. I'm sure a lot of people would be curious to hear
yeah,
what you
never
thought.
say never.
Uh, Maybe we'll add some other themes, or maybe it'll be all power metal themed. But whatever next week's is, we hope you will join us once again. Thanks again for tuning into the podcast. Always good just to dive into these sort of conversations and just sort of work them out as Christians. That's always sort of been our hope, is that whether we land somewhere good or just sort of raise questions or just, think out loud, I just think it's healthy for Christians to be involved in these conversations. So next week, we hope you will join us once again, whether we're talking about some controversy story or just German power metal. We will see you every Thursday for more conversations on faith and pop culture.